Okay, please come in, and if you don't want to come in, please be quiet. I would like to introduce a special guest that we have today. This is Professor Dr. Bernard Comrie, Director of the Department of Linguistics at the Max Planck Institute, and also a professor at the University of California. You probably read at least some of his books. He wrote a lot of very influential works, and I would just hand the mic over to him.
Okay, thank you. Happy noon, Olgeta. Good afternoon, everyone. I thought I would start off in a lingua franca, that was Tokpisin, which I didn't actually list on my list of languages, though I do sort of speak it. What I would like to do in my talk this afternoon is to give you some idea of the link between linguistics as an academic discipline and the study of various languages. So I want to try and bridge the gap between the interest in languages, which I know is what unites all of you, and the scientific study of those languages. And the way in which I'm going to present the material is by sort of alternating between bits of my own autobiography, so how I became a linguist, and bits of data, languages that I was working on at the time, or issues that I started working on then and that have come back to haunt me since then. Now, I guess some people are born into environments that cause them to be linguists. I wasn't. This is my hometown, Sunderland, the northeast of England. It's a very monolingual area. There are different varieties of English around, so some people might claim that the local variety of English is actually a foreign language. But at any rate, although I alternated between different varieties of languages, different varieties of English, my father is from Jamaica, so I had some Jamaican input as well. But nonetheless, it was fairly monolingual. I suppose if I had really hunted, I would have found speakers of other languages. Even at that time in the northeast of England, there were speakers of Yiddish, of Punjabi, variety of languages. But I started off at the languages with the languages that were offered at school. So this is the grammar school that I went to. When you see a building that looks like this, built in England around 1900, you sort of know it's either a grammar school or a prison. And basically, if there are bars at the window, then it's a grammar school. Okay, so this is the school, the grammar school that I went to. And I pretty much exhausted the offerings of languages, certainly all of those that were offered officially, and I even went a little bit beyond the official curriculum. So I did French and Latin, as everyone did in those days in England, but also German, ancient Greek, and I started Russian at that school. And perhaps the point at which I realized, although I didn't realize it at the time, that I realized that I was going to be a linguist was when my teacher, a classics teacher of Latin and Greek, asked a question which, again, I didn't know at the time, but was actually a typological question. I guess we got to the point in the grammar of ancient Greek where we knew that in general verbs are supposed to agree in person and number with their subject. So if you have a third person plural subject like the men, hoiandres, iandres, depending on your pronunciation of Greek, then the verb has to be third person plural, so legusin. However, there's one systematic exception to that, and that is that if the subject noun phrase is of neuter gender, so Greek has masculine, feminine, neuter gender, if you have a word of neuter gender, then even though the subject is plural, ta oikemata, the buildings, then the verb has to be singular. So epesen, literally fell down. And the teacher posed the question, I think not to anyone in particular, he was just musing out loud. He sort of said, I wonder how many other languages have that. And I think to the other people in the class that was, okay, yeah, one might wonder about that, but now let's do something else. Talk about soccer. Soccer, football is what you were supposed to talk about in Sunderland. But I didn't. I sort of thought, that's an interesting question. Never thought about that. I went to the library, sort of got all the books on various languages. There weren't that many at that time in the library in Sunderland, but there were some. There was one on Georgian. And as I looked through various grammars, I found similar things, not quite identical, but similar things in some of these other languages. So in Georgian doesn't have grammatical genders like masculine, feminine, neuter, the way many Indo-European languages do. But it does make a distinction between animate and inanimate nouns, specifically with respect to agreement in the third person plural. So if you have an animate noun like the children, so the children grow, then you'd have izrdebian, plural. But if you have the trees grow, so hebi, the trees, then you'll get izrdeba, literally grows, singular. And in some Celtic languages, so here illustrated by Welsh, here it's not a distinction according to the gender of the noun phrase, but whether the subject is a pronoun or not. So this is rather literary Welsh, so if you have a plural pronoun, hui, they, then the verb will have to be in the plural, maint. In literary Welsh, you have a declarative particle at the beginning of statements or affirmative statements. If, however, the subject is a full noun phrase, subjects usually follow the verb in Welsh, like bechgyn, the boys, then the verb has to be in the singular. So, although I didn't know it, I had actually embarked on my first typological research project, typology of verb agreement, in particular, whether you have effects of animacy or gender, or the pronoun, non-pronoun distinction, or some other distinction, some other similar distinction in different languages. And although I never carried that project through to fruition, I've never written an article specifically on this, many of the things that I've done since then actually follow very much in the line of that early piece of research. Now, I suppose many of my ancestors growing up on the coast of the North Sea, when they got to a certain age, maybe, well, in those days, maybe even 13, 14, certainly when they got to 16 or 17, they would start dreaming about running away from home to go to sea. And I had no great desire to run away from home to go to sea, so I decided to run away from home to learn languages. Now, let me be honest, I didn't actually run away from home. I did have my parents' consent. They never, I think, never understood, to the dying day, why I wanted to go into linguistics, but at any rate, they never tried to stop me. They always gave me every encouragement. And I ran away not to sea, but to Germany. I was fortunate to get a scholarship to spend my last school year at the Landheim Schondorf am Ammersee. So ich habe ein Jahr in diesem Internat gewohnt und gelernt. Okay, so I spent a year at this boarding school, so I lived there and I went to school there. Just to give you a rough idea where it is, sorry, these colors don't show too well, but this is Munich here. These are various lakes in Upper Bavaria. This is the Ammersee, and that's Schondorf on the shore of the Ammersee. So this was my first experience of living in a foreign country extensively, intensively. Basically, my whole life for that year was carried out in German, I guess with the exception of the French and Russian classes that I took, which were done in French and Russian. My next stop was the University of Cambridge. I discovered that in Cambridge at that time, although it was not possible to major in linguistics, you couldn't do linguistics as the only thing, nonetheless, Cambridge had a very flexible BA program, which meant that you could do mainly linguistics and very little literature. Most of the other people who were students in modern languages were more interested in literature. We were sort of a small group, considered rather weird, who were interested in languages and linguistics. But nonetheless, it did give me the opportunity, first of all, to meet linguistics as an academic discipline, and also to study the histories of various languages. So I did English, German, Russian, also some a little bit with Romance. Okay, so this is Cambridge, England. So these are actually the two colleges, so Clare College and King's College, where I lived. So Clare as an undergraduate, King's as a graduate student. This is not me, incidentally, about to fall in the river. This is a picture from the internet. But while I was in Cambridge, I was actually there for 13 years. I mean, as an undergraduate, then a graduate student, then I had a research position, then a lectureship position. While I was there, I had the chance to run away for another year and to spend a year at Moscow State University. So this is a real picture. This is me in front of the main building of Moscow State University. It's obviously a recent picture. It was actually taken last year. No, в этом здании я тоже жил. Okay, I lived in that building as well. So the main building of Moscow State University. It also includes student accommodation. While I was there, of course, I was largely working on Russian, I mean, improving my Russian. I actually wrote my doctoral dissertation about Russian. But I also got interested in other languages of the then Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, and neighboring areas. Now, one thing which probably many of you have noticed as polyglots is that often, even if one speaks a foreign language very well, for most purposes, you get by completely fluently. Maybe even there are periods when native speakers of the language are prepared to believe that you're a native speaker. But one point where you're likely to come unstuck is when suddenly you have to do numerals, you have to do numbers. So you're fluent, you're going fluently along, you're doing all your shopping, and then you're sort of at the checkpoint, and the person mutters something to you. You sort of recognize these are probably numerals, but you look at the electronic cash register to see. You do what you're not supposed to do. Now, my Russian teacher, even though this was before the days of electronic cash registers, knew perfectly well that that's what students do, people learning foreign languages. He had learned Russian in the British Army, so in the military discipline, and numerals were apparently very important. Not sure exactly why. You had to process prisoner of war's service numbers or whatever, but at any rate, he insisted that we practice with numbers. And this gave me a lasting interest in the structure of numeral systems across the languages of the world. Now, Russian itself is not maybe that exotic a numeral system in terms of the structure of the numerals. When you come to putting numerals in sentences, it gets fiendishly complex for reasons that have some historical validity. The numbers 2 through 4 take the following noun in the genitive singular. Okay, so very strange rules. But anyway, the actual forms are fairly straightforwardly decimal. So 3,000, 3,000, 300, 300, 30, 30, not exactly transparent. The word for 10 is 10, but very similar. And then 3 is 3. And if you want to say 3,333, then pretty much as in English, you just make up the individual bits, put them one after the other, going from higher to lower. And you probably don't think about it, though you're actually doing addition. Each of these elements has to be added together. You're doing multiplication, so you have to multiply 1,000 by 3, 100 by 3, 10 by 3. And in a sense, you're doing exponentiation. 10 to the power of 0, 10 to the power of 1, 10 squared, 10 to the power of 3. Okay, so actually you're doing all of that, even though you probably don't think about that. And in Russian, there are a few exceptions. So although the system is in general transparent, the word for 40, and this is not typical of Slavic languages, it's basically a Russian phenomenon. The word for 40 is 40. Just have to learn that. 13, as in English, the order is actually shifted. You say 3 on 10 rather than 10, 3. And of course, English also has exceptions. So the English word 11 is not what you would predict as the number to come between 10 and 12. You just have to learn it. You may then find out historically that originally meant one left over, so it starts making a little bit more sense, but still synchronically it's just an arbitrary form. So I started looking at numeral systems in other languages. So Russian, like actually nowadays the majority of the world's languages, has a decimal system, so base 10. However, one of the languages that I made the acquaintance of when I was at Moscow State University, so first in 1970 and later on in what was then called Leningrad, so St. Petersburg in 1976, when I actually met a couple of speakers of Chukchi. I've never been to Chukotka, so this part of the far east of the Russian Federation, but I was able to work with speakers. And the interesting thing about Chukchi is that its traditional numeral system is vigesimal, so base 20. So one way in which languages of the world can differ from one another is what base they choose for their numeral system. So in Chukchi, if you want to say 312, then you have to do 15 times 20. That's 300. I'm testing your numeral skills, you see that? 15 times 20, that's 300. And then you add 10 to that, and then there are 2 left over. So it's 15 20s plus 10, and then add the last 2 that are left over. An interesting question is, what are the limits on that? So you have languages with 10, with 20 as a base. How about 32? A language with 32 as a base. Probably sounds implausible, but there is at least one. The language is Ngiti, so a Sudanic language spoken in the northeast of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the traditional counting system, it's rather gone out of use, but it was used certainly traditionally for things like traditional activities like negotiating bride prices. So 128, so you wanted to buy something which was 128 francs or whatever, then you had to do it as 4 32s. And notice I've written 32 solidly, so no word boundary in 32, no hyphen or anything. 32 is a single morpheme, just like 10 in English, except that it means 32. Pardon? You can actually to count, to get up to 32, you do it in 4s. Yeah. So they're actually, you're right, you don't have 32 completely distinct numbers. No, you're right, you have lower bases, but then 32 is the most productive one. So that's the one you use to get up to higher and higher numerals. Of course, as many of you know, even some less exotic European languages, like French, for instance, although French is basically a decimal system, it does have little bits of it which are vigesimal. So instead of saying transparently in the word for 80, 80, so 4 20s. But also to some extent the word for 76, 60 is 60, but you don't then, in standard French, mainstream French, you don't then create a new term for 70. Instead, you just count 6010, 6011, 6012, and so on. So 76 is 76. At least in most of the French-speaking world. I did sort of come unstuck on my first visit to French-speaking Belgium. I was actually visiting a family that I knew in Liège. I normally had spoken English with the husband, but then with the rest of the family, I was speaking French. And they asked me something. I don't remember what the question was, but the answer was 76. And I said 76, very proud of myself. And they sort of looked at me in great puzzlement, started counting on their fingers, and then said, 76. Okay, so in Belgium, they don't count that way. They have a special word for 70. And they made it very clear to me that I was not to bring any of my Parisian manners north of the border, that they were not going to tolerate these challenges to their numerical abilities. Switzerland as well, yes. Also some regions in France. Yeah. Denmark is more complicated still, yes. You might ask, so we've looked at addition, multiplication, exponentiation. You might say, what about subtraction? Well, yes, some languages do use subtraction. So Latin, a nice classical example, unde viginti, 1 from 20 for 19. But Hindi, for instance, as a modern language, does something very similar. Division, perhaps, but all the examples that I'm familiar with actually are really multiplication by a fraction. Of course, mathematically, it's the same thing, but the literal form never says something like 100 divided by 2. It's always something like half 100, as in the Welsh in the traditional system, hanner cant, 50 expressed as half of 100. You'll be pleased to know there are no languages, certainly no known languages, which require you to express numerals as square roots. Okay, so I know of no language where 10 is the square root of 100. Another point which is interesting with numerals, which of course becomes interesting in German, for instance, also Arabic, a number of other languages, is the order of the different elements. The world tendency, so the overwhelming majority of the world's languages, order consistently from larger to smaller. So like English, 354, or like Mandarin Chinese, so Sanbai Wu Shi Si, so literally 300, 510, 4. A small number of languages, but it is still found, consistently order in the other direction. So Malagasy, the language of Madagascar, for instance, if you want to say 354, you start off with the 4, then the 50, then the 300. So Efetra, Ambidi Mampulu, Sitelunzat. And of course, then famous examples like German, Dutch, Arabic. Basically, you order larger to smaller. Certainly, you do that for larger combinations. But for smaller combinations, you use the inverse order. So in German, smaller before larger up to 99, larger before smaller otherwise. And this is what, even after having lived in Germany now continuously, almost continuously for 15 years, in addition to my earlier experiences with German, this is where I'm still likely to get unstuck if I'm not ready for it, if I'm not waiting for a number and someone will say a number, 354, say that to me quickly, and I will have to stop, probably ask them to repeat it because I didn't store it in short-term memory. And then I can process it. Okay, I get that it's 300 plus 4 plus 50. And of course, the problem with longer numerals in German is that you have to do that every second and third item all the way along. Okay, so 256,000. You have to remember that was 56,000, 374. Okay, now after the years that I spent in Cambridge, I decided it was time for a move again, and I moved to a very different part of the world. I moved to Los Angeles, California. So I spent the next 20 years working actually in this building. This was the building that housed my office at the University of Southern California. But during this period, I got to do one of the things I had always wanted to do as a linguist. Namely, I got to do a real field project, so not going to another urban area like Moscow, working on the language, but actually going to Papua New Guinea to do field work, in fact, field work on a language called Haruai with between 1,000 and 2,000 speakers. So here you see a picture of me, a younger version of me. It's this one, this is me. Working with a native speaker of Haruai as a teenager. He's wearing that sort of strange net bag over his head because he is undergoing initiation. So that's a sign that he is undergoing initiation. And among the Haruai, the main outward sign of that, apart from the hat, is there are certain foods which are forbidden, including water, which is kind of tough because it's about the only thing there is to drink. So you actually have to, he actually has to get liquid by chewing sugar cane or eating fruit or whatever. So roughly where this language is spoken, as you may know, Papua New Guinea is a linguistically very diverse area. So the country of Papua New Guinea may be somewhere between 700 plus different languages. The area where I was working was actually in this area here. It's a remote area. So when I first went there, to get from the closest airstrip to the village was a 9-hour walk. Later on, they opened an airstrip somewhat closer. More specifically, the language I was working on was this one, Haruai. I'm going to be mentioning a couple of neighboring languages. So this language here, Aramo. This one here on the other side, Coban, and maybe the sort of larger language by local standards further off to the east, Kalam, spoken here. Now, when I went to work on Haruai, really no one had worked on the language before. People had worked on neighboring languages, especially Coban. In fact, one of my PhD students wrote his PhD dissertation, A Grammar of Coban. But virtually nothing was known about it. A couple of years before I did the field project, I had done a pilot project. I had gone with my former student, John Davis, and we had done a survey of various languages spoken in the area where Coban and Haruai are spoken. And what we were able to do at that point, since we were basically just collecting basic vocabularies, was to look at what percentage of vocabulary was similar between the two languages. So you'll see Haruai shares roughly 35% of its vocabulary with Coban, its basic vocabulary, roughly 36% of its vocabulary with Aramo. Now, of course, if Coban and Aramo also shared around a third of the vocabulary, it would not be very interesting, but they don't. They only share about 19% of their vocabulary, so much, much lower. So putting Coban and Aramo together, sorry, putting Haruai and Aramo together just on the basis of vocabulary would be misleading, because it leaves out of account the fact that Coban and Aramo are not particularly close to one another. But as I started working more and more on Haruai, and I was occasionally able to talk to Aramo people who were moving through the area, comparing them with Coban and Kalam, which had already been discussed in the early literature, it became very clear that in terms of its basic morphology, Haruai and Aramo are very, very close. They're, I would estimate, about as close as Spanish and Italian. So the verb morphologies, Haruai and Aramo, are almost identical. They're very different from Coban and Kalam. Just give you the present tense of a verb, the verb to go, in Haruai and Aramo, and you then see how close they are. So when you look at the morphology, it becomes very clear that Haruai and Aramo are two closely related languages. Coban is at best very distantly related, and in terms of its basic grammatical structure and the very basic vocabulary, I'd be more inclined to say they're not related or not provably relatable. Maybe in the very distant past, but not in a way that we can prove at present, or in a way that we might indeed ever be able to prove. So that raises a question. So as a linguist, I sort of want to have answers to the puzzles. What accounts for the apparently high level of lexical borrowing from Coban into Haruai? Because if Coban and Haruai are not related languages, they don't descend from a common ancestor, then the shared vocabulary must have been borrowed. Notice here I'm assuming a particular direction. There are good reasons for that, but for the moment let's just assume that. And the answer is word taboo. Now, word taboo, it's a phenomenon you've probably heard, a term you've probably heard in European languages, North American languages, many other parts of the world. Word taboo basically means you're not supposed to use certain words referring to certain body parts, certain bodily functions, and so on. In Haruai, word taboo is a very different function. First of all, you have to know that people's names, so the proper name of a person, in Haruai will normally be an ordinary word of the language. So one of the people I worked with closely was called Ernungsa. Ernung means mountain, and Sir is then something you can attach to the end to mean up there, up over there. So his name was simply Mountain. In the culture, it is forbidden. People believe that if you break this taboo, then maybe your crops will fail, maybe your children will die. Not inclined to put it to the test. But at any rate, it is forbidden to utter the name of your cross cousin. So cross cousin is your father's sister's child or your mother's brother's child. You can't utter the name of your cross cousin, nor can you utter the name of one of your in-laws. When a word has to be replaced because of word taboo, the replacement is often, not always, but often, the Coban equivalent. And in a small community, 1,000 to 2,000 people, you're quite likely to be related to lots of people in this community. So if you marry someone, then lots of people are not going to be able to use that word anymore. So it can actually lead to replacement of the word. The word actually goes out of use. There are hardly any people left who are allowed to use it. And you may have noticed a bit about the in-laws. It's of course also useful to have synonyms handy, say an original Haruai word and the equivalent Coban word, just in case one of your relatives happens to marry someone with that name. What makes it worse is the traditional marriage pattern among the Haruai was elopement by mutual consent. So if two people wanted to get married, they just ran away. And eventually their relatives would find them, pretend at least to be very angry, and then everything would be arranged and they would be considered married. But you could be surprised. One incident did happen while I was there. Two people that no one had thought were together did actually run away. And the two families nearly got into a fist fight over it, but eventually everything was worked out. Of course, they had to change a lot of their vocabulary. What about Coban numerals? You remember I sort of surprised you, Ngiti 32 was a base, though as someone noticed, 32 is maybe not all that strange because it has lots of factors, like, well, 4, basically multiply 4 by itself several times. Coban has a numeral system with a base of 23. And in fact, this is typical of Highland New Guinea, that numeral systems operate in the following way. So you need to look at me for this. I'll try and do it without the microphone. You start counting the little finger of your left hand. You lower the fingers, so not the Anglo-Saxon way of raising them, you lower them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the names of the numbers are the same as the names of the fingers. So if I were counting in American English, I would start off counting pinky. American English for little finger. Okay, so I've got to 5, that was my thumb. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. I've done one passage across my body. That was 23. In most of these systems, there's a midpoint, so it's either here or here, usually, which means the midpoint is nearly always an odd number. The base is nearly always an odd number. Yeah, you had a question?
So are you implying that also they have different names for your left forearm and your right forearm?
You can distinguish them. You don't have to. If, of course, you're pointing, remember, this is a language used traditionally. I mean, now, of course, everyone has a mobile phone as well. But in those days, this was a language used only in face-to-face interaction. So you would point, and then you could see which side you're on. But there are ways you can say on the other side. And when you've got to 23, you can then start coming back. You will get to 46 when you're back to the little finger. And at least some people, I don't really know how general this was in the community, but at least some people were able to keep track of how many times they'd gone across the body. So you can actually say, well, I've done 4 passages across the body. So that's going to be 23 times 4, is that 92? Something like that. And now I've done 5 on top of that. So I've done 4 23s and 5. Okay, so probably there's no answer to the question, what are the limitations on the bases that numeral systems can have? There are practical limitations. So if you sort of decide that your numeral system is going to have a base of 523,374, then you've got yourself a number of problems that you're going to have to solve. But anything which is practically viable probably can be used. Just maybe one example to show how sort of strange things can actually be found in the Star Trek series. So in Klingon, in traditional Klingon, the numeral base was 3. And of course, 3 is not, if you look at many books on or articles on typology of numeral systems, you will not find base 3. But it is found in one language. The language is now extinct, but is well attested in one indigenous language of the Texas-Mexico border area, Coahuilteco. Okay, it's very clear. Base 3 to count up to 20, and then use base 20 for counting higher. So strange things probably can still be found. We're now up to about 15 years ago in my autobiography, and this was the point which I decided, time to move again. In English, there isn't really any term for the German term Wanderlust. I think we just sort of say Wanderlust. But at any rate, I was obviously born with this. So I decided, I got an offer from the new Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. And one of the things which I have been able to do as the director of that department is to sponsor large projects much bigger than anything I would have been able to do at a university, probably even with outside funding. And one of the main projects, in fact our flagship project, is the World Atlas of Language Structures. So I want to talk about a little bit about this. This will be sort of my last major point. So it was originally published as a book with 4 editors, so Haspelmatt, Dreyer, Gill, and me. The current version, so the later versions, are being looked after by Haspelmatt and Dreyer, which is why I've put their names in boldface there. Even the original book version, which came out from Oxford University Press at almost 700 pages, already had an interactive reference tool. So it had a CD-ROM with the database and with various pieces of software, which meant that you were able to not only look at the maps, but also to use the data underlying the maps to carry out research projects. And by arrangement with the publisher, 3 years after publication, all the material started being made available on the web. Nearly all of it is available on the web. So if you want to play with it or use it for research or whatever, then please do so. The URL is very simple. It's waltz.info. You can type HTTP and all those things in front. That will work. You don't have to, but don't try typing anything at the end. People sort of assume it must be .de or something at the end. No, that won't work. So with that atlas, what we tried to do was to represent in map form the structural diversity, the grammatical diversity of the world's languages. Let's look at some examples. I think that will make it clearer. So for instance, we know some languages have tone. Some languages are tone languages, so they can distinguish different lexical items or sometimes different grammatical forms of the same lexical item by means of pitch. So in Mandarin Chinese, you have a 4-tone system. So the word for mother, ma, the word for hemp, ma, the word for horse, ma, and the word for to reproach, ma. So those are 4 completely different words. Therefore, an interesting question is, well, as you look across the languages of the world, how many languages have tone systems? How many don't? How rich are those various tone systems? For the purposes of the map, we made a three-way distinction. So the red dots here are languages with complex tone systems. By that we meant a three or more way distinction. The pink dots are simple tone systems, so a binary opposition. And the white dots, they probably don't show up very well, but basically the parts of the world where you don't see any other colored dots, those are the parts of the world where there are no tone systems, so where pitch is not used in order to distinguish lexical items. So that's an example from phonology. From morphology or from morphosyntax, we might ask about the gender system. So which languages have gender systems, which ones don't? Where they have gender systems, how many genders do they have? So Spanish has a two-gender system with masculine and feminine. This, of course, means that every noun, not only nouns referring to male and female humans, but every noun has to be put into one of those two genders. So tree ends up being masculine, house ends up being feminine. German has three genders, again, to a certain extent, semantically based. So the man, masculine, the woman, feminine. But many of the others, certainly synchronically, seemingly randomly distributed. My favorite example being the items of cutlery, of silverware, where the spoon is masculine, the fork is feminine, and the knife is neuter. And you just have to learn that. You may want to speculate on why that's the case. That I leave up to you. So here is a map of gender systems. The white dots, again, not very visible, languages with no gender system. It's a majority, 144 out of 256. The yellow dots with two genders, the orange dots with three, the red dots with four, and the black dots with five or more. The record is actually around a dozen, some varieties of Fula spoken in West Africa. People sometimes ask me, how come you can have 4 or 12 genders? You know, you've done males, they're masculine, you've done females, they're feminine. Everything else is neuter. You know, what can you possibly do with other genders? Well, some languages will have, for instance, a gender that is restricted to or correlates largely with animals. So you might have a special gender just for names of animals, or whose core is the name of animals, like the core of masculine gender in Spanish or German is male humans. So you can easily get up into those higher numbers. You'll notice that there's some geographical patterning here. So there's a plethora of black dots in sub-Saharan Africa. So nearly all Niger-Congo languages, in fact many of them actually Bantu languages.
Are there in Swahili the noun classes related to that? Or
Yes.
can we go up to 12? So
12 is in Fula, some dialects of Fula.
noun classes.
Actually, technically, pairs of noun classes, if you want a technical answer. Yeah. So noun classes distinguish singular. They actually distinguish gender and number. This is just looking at gender. Looking at syntax, so differences in word order. So some languages place the object after the verb, like English, the student bought the book. Other languages, like Japanese, place the object before the verb. So gakusei ga, then book, hon. So book with the accusative marker, katta. So literally student, book, bought. And here again, so the blue dots are the languages like Japanese, which place the object before the verb. The red dots are the languages like English, which place the object after the verb. The white dots are languages, they're actually supposed to be gray. The gray dots are languages which allow both with roughly equal frequency. You can again see some geographic patterning. Western Europe is largely red. Most of Asia, except for Southeast Asia, is largely blue. And the last example, numeral classifiers. So in English, I can take a numeral and a noun and just stick them together. 2 friends, 5 dogs, 10 books. In Thai, by contrast, I cannot do that. I must always use a classifier, and this classifier will typically tell me something about the semantics of the noun in question. So the classifier kun is used for human beings, the classifier tua for animals, among other things, and the classifier lim for bound objects like books, again, as well as certain other elements. So in Thai, although Thai doesn't have a gender system, it has something similar, which in some ways is even more complex because it makes more distinctions and is actually more flexible. But you have a way in Thai of indicating the class to which a noun belongs, and if you want to use a numeral, then that's obligatory. Notice numeral classifiers, especially in Southeast Asia. Just if I may want to take a couple of minutes more to answer one question, sort of research question that arose. Relatives and neighbors. Given this atlas, we can actually ask a question that turns out to be very interesting. That is, do languages tend to be more similar structurally to their relatives, so other languages from the same language family, or to their neighbors? And a good place to investigate this is Southeast Asia, where you have a number of different language families, so Austronesian, Sino-Tibetan, Austroasiatic, Tai-Kadai, and the small Hmong-Mien family, mainly southern China, but coming down into mainland Southeast Asia. We look at tone. Southeast Asia is a hotbed of tone languages. They belong to different families, in fact, all of the families that I mentioned. They're close relatives, so Austroasiatic languages are also spoken in northeastern India. Those are not tonal. Austronesian languages, for the most part, are not tonal, but the handful spoken on mainland Southeast Asia are. Talk about object and verb, order of object and verb. Again, Southeast Asia, red dots. The rest of Asia, solidly, almost solidly blue. Numeral classifiers. So again, Southeast Asia is one area, one hotbed of languages with numeral classifier systems. They're relatively rare, especially as obligatory across the languages of the world, but found very strongly here, languages of different families, and also by cultural diffusion, sort of spread from Chinese here across into Korean and Japanese. And in fact, you can look at 20 diagnostic features of Southeast Asian languages, establish the percentage that are found in different languages, and you end up with a map roughly like this. So Thai at the center with most of those features. As you move to the east or west, the number drops, more so to the west. As you move to the south, it drops. As you move to the north, by the time you get to the far north of Asia, well, it's not even the far north yet, by the time you get to Mongolia, so Mongolian has only one of those typical Southeast Asian features. Okay, in a year's time, I will actually be retiring from my job in Germany. And what would be a nice place to retire to? Well, how about Santa Barbara, California? That's the fate that awaits me. I plan to keep on working, so I plan to keep on doing the kinds of research that I've been reporting today. Kinds of research which I want to emphasize are scientific linguistic projects, but which nonetheless require input from a wide range of languages. So one of the things which has characterized my work in linguistics, I guess from the very beginning or even from before the beginning, is the importance of cross-linguistic variation, studying different languages to see how they're different from one another, how they're similar from one another, but doing that in a systematic, scientific way. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. This is for you.
Thank you very much.
And I think we have appreciation for coming all the way to Berlin.
Thank you.
Do we have time for any questions? Or?
I have time for questions. Okay. Yes, please.
Yes.
So when you were giving us the example of this you know, the picture with the little boy there. How do you, I forgot the language name, I'm sorry. Padawan, yes. How do you do about approaching a language that has no written records and, you know, dictionaries and audiobooks and whatever? How do you do that?
Well, there are actually various ways of sort of getting into the language. It depends in part on whether you have a shared language or not. Now, as it happened in this case, I did. So I had learned Tok Pisin in order to carry out this project. So I was able to start from the very beginning, both getting translations of basic lexical items, in part so I could get into the vocabulary of the language, but also to get into the phonology of the language. I could hear what the language sounded like. Not only, obviously I could listen to people talking, but they talked quickly, the way people always do in a language that you don't understand. So this was a way of slowing people down. It also meant not only could I ask for translations, but I could also ask people questions like, you know, tell me the names of frog species. And especially the boys, they would love this. This was one of their favorite tasks. They would sort of sit down and sort of rattle off long lists. And if I had a group of boys and one of them said, oh, you forgot this one, we'd be very, very proud to sort of add another one to the list. So, you know, depending who I was talking to, men might be more interested in, say, the names of animals that they would hunt, game mammals. Some people might be interested in names of vegetables, cultivars, so different subspecies of vegetables and so on. So I was able, and it was an advantage since the initial project I had was limited to 11 months, when I had funding for exactly 11 months. So to be able to do as much as I did in that time, I worked initially almost exclusively working through Tok Pisin, and then as I learned more and more of the language, started using the language. So that's sort of crucial. At some point, you really have to start using the language. I haven't had much practice since then, so it's one reason why I didn't write "How do I" on my badge here. I suppose the likelihood of my meeting someone who would challenge me on that is pretty low, but wanted to make sure. Not making claims that I can't live up to. Now, there's of course an alternative. It may well be that you have to work on a language and do not share a common language with the other person. Well, there you can't start out by asking for translations. You have to start out by pointing, listening very carefully to what people are saying. In a sense, you're faced there with the same task that the baby is faced with, working out its first language. Except the techniques you can use are somewhat different. The amount of goodwill you're likely to be shown is going to be somewhat different as well. Sort of babies are shown quite a lot of goodwill. Adults are supposed to learn things more quickly. The first person who actually worked on an indigenous language of Papua New Guinea, or of New Guinea, was a Russian anthropologist, Mikluha Maklai, partly of Scottish origin. And he sort of learned that the Germans were interested in establishing a colony in New Guinea. So the northwestern part of New Guinea was a German colony from the late 19th century until World War I. And he sort of basically went to the captain of a German ship going out that way and said, "Can I go with you?" And the captain couldn't think of any reason to say no, so he said yes. And then when they got to New Guinea, the captain said, "Well, okay, you get off here. I'll be back in a year's time. In the unlikely event that you're still alive, I'll take you back." Well, he survived the year. I mean, he got malaria inevitably and lots of other things as well. But he did survive. He worked a little bit on the local language, though more on the ethnography. And he left a lasting result in that some of the local languages have Russian loanwords in them. tapor, yeah, the word for axe, which comes out as sopor in the local language. Yeah.
I can understand that you can elicit names of fruits and things like that. How do we ask a combine like that to produce a relative phrase, relative clause?
Okay. Well, the answer is basically you don't. Once you've got some of the basics, basic vocabulary, basic clause structure, then you start working with texts. You sort of say, you know, tell me a story. And in this culture, people were really happy to do that. So they would tell you the story. They would then, you then say, well, can you now tell me the story in Tokpisin? And they would do that. Then, of course, you have to start working. So I assume you've made an audio recording, ideally a video recording, though I didn't have video recording equipment back then. So with the audio recording, I would then work with someone, preferably someone else, but sometimes the same person, going through the story very slowly until essentially I understood not only every word, but also why that word was there, rather than anywhere else or not at all. Okay, so until I could really understand the texts. And then, of course, you notice, oh, that's a relative clause. Yeah. There are, I mean, in some cultures, you can elicit relative clauses through translation. Tokpisin is actually not an easy language in which to elicit. First of all, it's, at least in this part of New Guinea at this time, it was not anyone's native language. So the degree of competence in Tokpisin varied considerably. And I mean, my competence, and I was also not a native speaker, even near native speaker. There are different regional varieties of Tokpisin. Tokpisin has a very limited tense aspect mood system. So it's very hard, you know, to say, you know, how would you say he must have been singing? Well, no, you're not going to get any, no way you get anything like that through Tokpisin. So it certainly has strong limitations. So I think what it means is, you know, if you're doing field work as soon as possible, you can use a lingua franca, a vernacular, as a vehicular language as a crutch. But as soon as possible, you have to start walking on your own in the language.
I think we may have time for one more question, a quick one. Anyone? Yes?
So number systems. You said this language in Ngiti, right? 4 and 32. So in this case, I would say, as soon as for what I have understood, is a base 4 actually, and then the 32 is like a million in English,
okay,
or something like that. And so the question is, which is the maximum? So if Ngiti is 4 and English is 10, which is the maximum that is recorded?
32.
In which the first are all different numbers.
Okay, you have different numbers up to 4, so 1, 2, 3, 4. From 4 to 32, I'm recollecting here, so I hope I get everything right. And as I say, the system is going out of use, so even the linguist who worked on it did not give full data. But my recollection is you count in 4s, so 15 would be something like 3 4s plus 3. Till you get to 32, then you have a single, the crucial thing is, it's a single monomorphemic word, which means 32. And you then count in 32s above that. As far as I recall, there is no higher base. So there's no higher monomorphemic word. So if you wanted to say a million, unlikely, well, who knows, with inflation, you might, you know, Indonesians are very good at counting to very, very high numbers. But, you know, you'd sort of have to specify how many 32s there are in a million. But obviously, effectively what this means is the traditional system was presumably not used for counting all that high. You know, maybe it went up to somewhere around 100, but going above that, either very few people would control it, or maybe even no one. And it would basically have been used as a barter system. So if it's used for bride price, then you have to pay. You want to marry this woman, you have to pay so many goats, let's say. and it's unlikely to be a huge number. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm terribly sorry. I had to leave for totally different reasons. I missed one part of your lecture, so it might have been already answered. But when you, just before I went out, you mentioned the numbers, that the numbers are usually starting from the big to the small, right? And I would like to hear your opinion on this. The Arabs, you know, when they used, or the Chinese, they wrote from, they still write actually, from right to left, right? Right to left, the Chinese from top down, and right to left from top down. So the order, I mean, in the Chinese is probably the biggest one starts and then the smaller one, but in the Arabic I have doubts, because in Arabic when we write numbers, you know, from right you start the letters, and for example 321, you write 1, 2, 3, but then again the order is inverse, you know, the 1 is actually the first one from the right, the 2 is the second from the right. So actually the Arabs, they use the other way around, the small number first and then counting up to the big ones.
There are two different things that are involved there. One is your direction of writing, which I didn't talk about at all. I think Andre Müller there has already talked about typology of writing systems. The other is the order in which you produce them. I was just talking about, you know, if you're speaking, what is the order in which you produce things? So Chinese is actually like English, from higher to lower. Malagasy, from lower to higher. That's one possibility in Arabic. In Arabic, there are also alternatives, especially in modern Arabic. Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking about the writing system. So maybe when we borrowed the writing system from the Arabs, then we kept that order, but we write from left to right. So that's why it changed from to big.
But whatever the history, we ended up writing them in the order in which we say them. So that makes it easy. Yeah.
Thank you very much.